Losing a child is a heart-wrenching experience, and it's even more devastating when you find yourself, as parents, attending your own child's funeral. Children are the very essence of joy for parents, and they have an unparalleled capacity to enrich our lives in countless ways. So, to experience the loss of a child, particularly one's own, certainly inflicts a depth of pain that is unimaginable. In April of 2020, Vietnam was shaken as headlines of a local news outlet featured a heartbreaking story. A 3-year-old girl from Hanoi had been brutally abused and beaten to death. The news sent shockwaves through communities, sparking outrage and sorrow as people grappled with the senseless tragedy that had befallen the innocent child. Questions began to flood everyone's minds. Who could have committed such a heinous act? Why would someone inflict such pain on a defenseless child? And how could this have happened in their community? If the headline alone didn't evoke enough sadness and anger among readers, the article was accompanied by a photograph that intensified these emotions. The photo showed a couple, tears streaming down their faces, heads bowed, and hands tightly clasped. In the background, a portrait of the young girl loomed over the scene. The woman was seen in utter despair, as the caption identified them as the parents of the little girl. Their grief appeared to be a natural response to the death of their child, but upon closer examination, a startling detail emerged. Both of their hands were handcuffed. In that moment captured by the lens, a narrative unfolded, one of loss and perhaps of untold struggles. This photograph was a window into a family's shattered world, and it raised one burning question. Why were the girl's own parents handcuffed at her funeral? You're listening to Heinous, an Asian true crime podcast, brought to you by One Up Media. This episode may contain sensitive details and graphic imagery. Listener discretion is advised. On the afternoon of March 30th, 2020, Mrs. D, the grandmother of the little girl, received a message from the Hanoi District Police regarding an incident involving her granddaughter. She was then urgently requested to head to the Hanoi Medical University Hospital to confirm the child's identity. Upon her arrival, she received news that shook her to the core. Mrs. D was escorted into the emergency room, where the first thing she saw was a small body covered in white sheets. The sight alone was enough to signal bad news, but the realization that her own granddaughter lay beneath those covers struck her with an even greater force. The harsh reality of the situation weighed heavily on her heart as she grappled with the devastating truth. The medical team explained that the girl had suffered numerous injuries and showed signs of violence on her body. Due to the severity of her condition, they had already reported the incident to the police. But despite their best efforts to save her, it was too late. The girl had succumbed to her injuries. Immediately, investigators were dispatched to the hospital to conduct preliminary investigations, as well as question Mrs. D about what had happened. As per local news reports, 51-year-old Mrs. D claims that the young girl had been residing with her at her residence in Vong La Commune at the Dong An district of Hanoi. Mrs. D recounts that on March 5th, her daughter, the mother of the child, had requested her to bring the girl to the inner city of Hanoi. She also explains that her daughter had made this request under the pretense of taking the child out to play. While news sources do not explicitly clarify the nature of the relationship between Mrs. D and her daughter, it is noted that the girl's mother often finds herself entangled in complicated relationships and is frequently absent from the area. This circumstance likely prompted Mrs. D to insist on caring for the child herself. Understanding her daughter's tendency towards irresponsibility, Mrs. D believed it was in the best interest of the child to reside with her, as she knew she could provide a stable and secure environment amidst her mother's unpredictable lifestyle. Mrs. D had brought the young girl to meet her mother on the 5th of March, and sources indicate that she left the child in her care for the following weeks. However, on the 30th of March, after 25 days had passed, she received the devastating news of the child's death. With no idea what happened or what had caused this, questions swirled in her mind. Mrs. D struggled with a mix of grief, anger, and disbelief as she faced her profound loss. Amidst her pain, she was only interested in one thing: who was responsible for the little girl's death? Back at the hospital, relatives of Mrs. D and the little girl had arrived and were stunned by the news. Just a minute ago, everything seemed fine, but now they found themselves planning a funeral for a 3-year-old. As it was deemed an unnatural death due to the extensive bruises and injuries on her body, the hospital had to conduct a thorough medical examination to determine the cause of the little girl's death. According to forensic results obtained by the family, the little girl had suffered a sunken skull, severe brain damage, and a broken jaw. Furthermore, there were numerous deep bruises and injuries on her legs and arms, along with hair loss on her head. Pictures of the girl before her death revealed that she had a full head of hair down to her shoulders. However, post-mortem photos displayed clumps of missing hair and evident bald patches. These horrifying findings not only added to the family's anguish, but also highlighted the extent of the violence inflicted on the little girl. Mrs. D was now consumed by anger, but she wasn't prepared for the truth she would soon learn. Neither were the people of Vietnam. Due to her age, news reports of the incident referred to the young girl as M, a pseudonym, while her parents were identified as 31-year-old Nguyen Thi Lan and 29-year-old Nguyen Thi Lan Anh. Lan Anh was the girl's biological mother and Mrs. D's daughter, while Nguyen Thi Lan was her stepfather. Records indicate that Lan Anh had been married 3 times before, and M, who had just passed away, was the child of her first husband. This complex family dynamic added layers of confusion and concern as authorities delved into the circumstances surrounding the girl's tragic death. Examining the child's injuries, it was evident that she had been subjected to severe beating and possibly torture. The police were unable to determine if it was inflicted by hands or a weapon, but the brutality of the assault was unmistakable. The only question was, why would anyone inflict such cruelty upon a 3-year-old? This was a question that at the time, no one had the answers to. So investigators delved further, realizing that they should focus on who had brought the child to the hospital in the first place. According to the records, at 8 a.m. on March 30th, the day of the child's death, M's mother, Lan Anh, had taken the girl to the hospital upon realizing that M was experiencing difficulty breathing. Tragically, she died at 11 o'clock, just a few hours later, with the cause of death determined to be a traumatic brain injury. The records do not mention whether her stepfather, Nguyen Thi Lan, was present, but it didn't matter because doctors immediately recognized this as a case of severe child abuse. In medical school, doctors are trained to recognize signs of physical abuse and neglect, particularly in young patients. They are taught to look out for indicators such as unexplained injuries, repeated injuries, delayed medical care, and the behavior of their parents. Doctors are also trained to consider the possibility of abuse when there is a mismatch between the injury and the child's age, or when the injury doesn't match the explanation given for how it happened. In cases where doctors suspect child abuse, they are required to report their concerns to the appropriate authorities, such as Child Protective Services or law enforcement. This duty to report their findings is an essential aspect of every physician's role in protecting the welfare of their patients. When it came to the case of little M, The doctors likely recognized the severity and nature of her injuries, which led them to conclude that it was a case of child abuse. The sunken skull found on M indicates that she likely experienced a significant impact to the head, possibly from blunt force trauma. And due to the trauma to her head, it likely resulted in injury or bleeding within the brain tissue, which ultimately caused her death. The broken jaw is another indicator of severe physical trauma. It suggests a forceful blow to the face or head, causing the jawbone to fracture. Such injuries are also often seen in cases of physical abuse, where the child may have been struck in the face with significant force. Overall, the combination of M's injuries were consistent with child abuse, and the medical team were compelled to report their suspicions to the police. We cannot say for certain how M's mother behaved in the hospital, but our assumption is that she likely panicked or felt uneasy. This is despite experiencing deep sorrow and pain over the death of her daughter. It was her uneasiness that caught the attention of the police, leading them to suspect that she might have been hiding something. Whether she admitted it to the police herself, or they simply observed her behavior, 29-year-old Lan Anh and her husband Min Thuan were now the prime suspects. Given the severity of this case of child abuse, it was clear that the girl had been murdered. Public outcry surged as news reports flooded the nation about a case where parents abused their child to death. But it reached its peak when netizens stumbled upon a troubling Facebook post. The post contained over 10 photos, with most of them showing the parents and the young girl. The first image portrayed her funeral service, with M's photo surrounded by incense sticks, flowers, and mourning relatives. Yet, what followed were even more disturbing photographs. One of the images depicted her lying in what appeared to be the hospital's mortuary. She wore a baby blue dress and was clutching a teddy bear in her right hand. Her legs, however, had deep red bruises, which marred her skin. The sight of these injuries sent shivers down viewers' spines, hinting at the unspeakable horrors the girl had endured. Another image depicted M lying in her coffin, surrounded by mourners kneeling beside her, their tears bearing witness to the unfolding tragedy. However, the most disturbing photo that truly shook viewers was the final one attached to the post. It was one of M's face. Despite being blurred, there were unmistakable signs of dried blood covering her face, and clumps of her hair were noticeably missing. These pictures were hard to stomach for many people, as no one could comprehend how or why this could have happened. Examining the photo of the young girl before the tragedy, she appeared lively and bubbly, as any 3-year-old should. But now, with these photos of the aftermath, it's impossible for many not to feel furious. The thought that she may have been struck so hard that clumps of her hair fell out, or even torn from her head, is truly heartbreaking. It was now April 3rd, 2020, and Vietnam was still grappling with the shocking news of the child abuse case. The Hanoi District Police wasted no time and promptly issued a warrant for the arrest of Lan Anh. Meanwhile, Min Thuan, the stepfather, was also taken into custody. Subsequently, the files and suspects were transferred to the Hanoi City Criminal Police Department for further investigation. While it was unclear if the couple denied the allegations of child abuse during their arrest, it was evident that they would not be set free without facing severe punishment. Then, during a routine medical test, Min Thuan tested positive for narcotics, indicating that he had consumed drugs before M's death. This only added fuel to the fire, and the public was now more infuriated than ever. But what makes this one of Vietnam's most heinous cases of child abuse is not just the fact that the victim was killed, but the horrific ordeal she endured prior to her death. It's now April 3rd, 2020, and Vietnam is in turmoil over the appalling child abuse case in Hanoi that led to the tragic death of a 3-year-old girl named M. The news has ignited a wave of anger across the country, but it has also sparked a myriad of questions about the root causes behind such heinous acts. In particular, people began to ask about what M's own parents did to her and what had motivated them to commit such atrocities. 29-year-old Thi Lan Anh was the biological mother of the child, while her husband, 31 years old Nguyen Thi Lan, served as the girl's stepfather and Lan Anh's third husband. According to authorities in Hanoi, both Lan Anh and Nguyen Thi Lan are known to be drug addicts, with Nguyen Thi Lan even testing positive for drugs upon his arrest. Investigations revealed a disturbing timeline of events prior to the girl's death. On March 5, 2020, Mrs. D, the girl's grandmother, brought her to Lan Anh's home in Dong Da district as she had requested to spend some time with the child. The girl remained in her mother's care for 25 days until doctors pronounced her dead in the hospital on March 30th. An autopsy conducted later revealed horrifying details. The 3-year-old had not consumed any food for at least 24 hours prior to her death, a fact that was corroborated by both Nguyen Thi Lan and Lan Anh, who admitted that they had stopped feeding the child on March 29th. Following close examination of the bruises and injuries on the girl's body, medical examiners provided the police with their suspicions regarding what had transpired. Armed with this information, the police confronted the parents during their interrogation, leading to a shocking revelation of the truth. The details of what Lan Anh and Nguyen Thi Lan did to their 3-year-old daughter were undeniably horrifying. The mere thought of an innocent child of that age enduring such suffering is difficult to bear, but as the details unfold, it becomes clear that this case delves into darker depths. What exactly did her parents do to her? And what had led them to inflict such cruelty on their own flesh and blood? The details of Lan Anh and Nguyen Thi Lan's actions against their 3-year-old daughter are distressing to hear, yet it's crucial that we grasp the depth of their depravity. Only by understanding the extent of their crimes can we assess whether their sentences would be justified. According to multiple news reports about the case, both parents had an equal share of responsibility when it came to the abuse and torture of the 3-year-old girl. On March 5th, 2020, the same day the girl was brought to her mother's home to stay, her stepfather Nguyen Thi Lan brought drugs back home. He wasn't a drug dealer, but rather a consumer, and he shared this habit with Lan Anh. The couple's drug use was not confined to private moments. Shockingly, they would consume drugs right in front of the child, even getting high, while the girl cried for attention. At 3 years old, children are still highly dependent on their parents for their basic needs, such as feeding and toileting, and they require constant attention when not sleeping. While sources don't specify whether the couple were under the influence of drugs 24/7 during the 25 days the girl was there until her death, one can only speculate about the impact of their drug use on their ability to care for the child. It's highly likely that for at least 3 weeks, the girl did not receive enough attention and may have been neglected due to her parents' drug use. She may have gone hungry for prolonged periods of time, sat in her own soiled diapers for days, and possibly cried for attention while her parents were high. Sources do not explicitly mention any incidents of physical abuse during this period, but the neglect of a child's needs can be considered a form of abuse. Newspapers reported that on March 29th, little M was misbehaving and crying loudly for her parents' attention. Instead of tending to her needs and comforting the child, Lan Anh and Nguyen Thi Lan took turns beating her. We've heard this story before. Parents, particularly in Asian cultures, resorting to physical punishment when their children misbehave. But do we truly understand the reasons behind this approach? And is it an effective deterrent for misbehavior? The short answer is no, it's not. Parents resort to physical punishment for various reasons, and oftentimes it stems from a lack of effective parenting strategies, cultural beliefs, or personal stressors. Some parents may believe that physical discipline is necessary to teach obedience and respect, while others may unknowingly use it as a way to vent their own frustrations. In some cases, parents may have grown up in environments where physical punishment was normalized, and when they grow up to become parents themselves, they would replicate these patterns with their own children. However, there's a growing understanding that physical punishment can have long-term detrimental effects on children. Research shows that it can lead to increased aggression, lower self-esteem, and even mental health issues. Despite this, many parents continue to use physical discipline out of a belief that it is the only way to control their children's behavior. But there's a limit to how much parents can physically discipline a child. While discipline is important for teaching boundaries and values, using violence or aggression only teaches children that it's normal to solve problems with brute force. There's also a limit to the amount of physical violence one can impose on a child before it crosses from disciplinary action to outright torture. In this case, Lan Anh and Nguyen Thi Lan have exceeded all thresholds, turning what should be discipline into an act of torture. Sources state that after beating the child, she wouldn't stop crying, and her cries grew even louder. In response, Lan Anh and Nguyen Thi Lan escalated the violence by hitting her harder, repeatedly striking the child on her head, face, and neck for more than 6 times. Their methods of punishment went beyond using their hands. They also used household objects, such as a metal broomstick and a plastic broom handle, to inflict harm on the child. But apparently, that didn't stop the crying, and Lan Anh and Nguyen Thi Lan resorted to even more cruel forms of torture. According to sources, when the beating proved ineffective, they dragged her to the bathroom and forced her to kneel in a washtub. They even went as far as poking her hands with needles and once again hitting her on her head and face. It was highly probable that one of the blows from the broomsticks had caused her death, as doctors revealed she had died from a traumatic brain injury. This indicated that one of them had struck her so forcefully that it cracked a piece of her skull and caused her brain to bleed. The thought of a 3-year-old experiencing such pain is unimaginable, especially at the hands of her own parents. Reports state that the abuse started at 8 a.m. on March 29th and continued until around 2 a.m. the following day. This meant that M endured beatings and violence for more than 18 hours before her body could no longer take any more. In the early hours of March 30th, Lan Anh noticed that her daughter was floating in and out of consciousness and was unable to drink any milk. Despite attempting CPR, it was unsuccessful, and the girl's body went limp. Lan Anh promptly hailed a taxi and rushed to the hospital, but M was pronounced dead upon arrival. The public now knew about the atrocious acts committed on M by her own parents, but many questions remained unanswered, particularly about the prevalence of child abuse in Vietnam. How often do such incidents occur in the country, and what are the reasons for children being abused? The answers to these questions, however, may surprise you. Recent statistics indicate that Vietnam has experienced a consistent increase in reported cases of child abuse over the past decade. In 2021 alone, the hotline for domestic abuse received over 600,000 calls for assistance. The majority of these cases involved violence against children, with 73% of them caused by immediate family members. In 2022, a survey conducted by UNICEF revealed that nearly 70% of Vietnamese children aged 1 to 14 have experienced domestic violence at the hands of their parents or caregivers. However, it's widely acknowledged that many cases go unreported, indicating a much higher actual prevalence. Some of these cases of child abuse were so egregious that they made national headlines, much like the tragic death of little M. In late December 2021, an 8-year-old girl was taken to a hospital in Ho Chi Minh City. When she arrived, she was already deceased. A police investigation found she had been violently abused for 4 hours by her stepmother, who beat her with wooden sticks, kicked her, slapped her, and bound the girl to a chair, forcing her to sit up and study. In 2023, 2 kindergarten teachers in Hanoi were sentenced to life in prison for the fatal abuse of a 17-month-old child. According to police reports, the 2 women became frustrated with the child's incessant crying as class was in session. In response, one of them dragged the child and threw him onto a mattress on the floor. When the boy continued to cry, she screamed at him and slapped him. As the crying persisted, the other teacher used her feet to kick and stomp on the child's belly, chest, and ears. This abuse occurred on several occasions. However, one day, the child vomited and became unconscious. In an attempt to revive him, the teacher slapped him and splashed water on his face, but to no avail. The child spent the next few days in the hospital, where he eventually succumbed to his injuries. Forensic results revealed that the boy died from respiratory failure due to traumatic brain injuries. These are just a few examples of the many serious cases of child abuse that have plagued Vietnam for years. But unfortunately, the problem doesn't seem to be stopping anytime soon. Child abuse is not an isolated incident in Vietnam, but rather a deeply ingrained problem all around the world. In Singapore, the number of cases investigated for serious child abuse or neglect concerns doubled from slightly over 1,000 cases in 2019 to about 2,000 cases in 2021 during the COVID-19 pandemic. However, a spokesperson from the Child Protective Services noted that due to the strict laws and robust social services in place to combat child abuse, fewer than 3 out of every 1,000 children were investigated for abuse or neglect concerns. This is promising news that the number of cases is decreasing, but Vietnam, on the other hand, faces unique challenges. In Vietnam, the hierarchical family structure and societal norms often lead to the normalization of punishment as a form of discipline. Additionally, poverty and lack of education can exacerbate stressors within families, increasing the likelihood of abusive behavior. Furthermore, the stigma surrounding mental health issues and the limited availability of support services for victims of abuse create significant barriers to intervention and recovery. Compared to Singapore, where there's a greater emphasis on mental health awareness and support, Vietnam struggles to provide adequate resources for those in need. But things are getting better. Awareness campaigns regarding child abuse are gradually permeating society, with people starting to speak out and call for more effective laws and enforcement. Awareness is spreading through social media, and there are even efforts to design games to educate children on how to protect themselves. In Ho Chi Minh City, children as young as 6 have enrolled in charity-run self-defense classes, all in an effort to combat the rising issue of child abuse. On April 2, 2020, the investigative police agency under Hanoi's Police Bureau began their legal proceedings into the case. That afternoon, the police announced that both Nguyen Thi Lan and Lan Anh would be detained for up to 4 months while an investigation was conducted into charges of murder and illegal possession of narcotics. During questioning at the police station, the 2 suspects confessed to beating the child at least 7 times on March 29th alone, which ultimately resulted in her death. Several months later in November, Nguyen Thi Lan was given the death penalty for the murder of 3-year-old M, while Lan Anh, the girl's mother, was sentenced to life imprisonment. In court, when Nguyen Thi Lan was questioned about his crimes, he claimed to have only hit her a few times, suggesting the girl might have died from a cold. However, the judge and jury asserted they had sufficient evidence to prove otherwise, leading to the decision to sentence him to death. As for Lan Anh, the judge said that she had failed to protect her daughter and failed in her duties as a mother. The jury agreed that she deserved death, but due to her having another young child to raise, she would avoid death, but spend the rest of her life behind bars. Heinous, an Asian true crime podcast, is brought to you by One Up Media. This episode was produced and written by Guangjin, edited by Alex, narrated by Jason, audio experience by Ethan Sam, additional engineering by Ashley from One Up Media. Thank you for listening. We'll see you in the next one.